Hello and welcome to the new series of webinars from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times, and I'm delighted to be here today. Our intention for these webinars is to continue the conversation for the Emergency Services show. Hopefully many of the people watching now or on catch up will have been to the show and seeing that we have lots and lots of speakers at the show, we have lots of content. And we wanted to continue that conversation because whilst you may have had the privilege of being at the show, many of you may not have. And so for us, it's a way of allowing you to see them and to have a bit more of a chat with me. And we then can find out what they've been doing since the show as well. And hopefully that will be a really interesting thing for you watching today. We're going to cover a range of topics. Today is about resilience, and then next week we'll be doing drones. And then we have electric vehicles. So first three before Christmas, and then hopefully after Christmas we'll be doing some more, but this is the first three for now. We're going to ask our speakers today, who I will introduce you to shortly, to talk about their work, insights and thoughts about the future, about the topic resilience today. And for us, the unique selling point of these webinars is that we're multi-agency. So we're really interested in looking at police, fire, ambulance, search and rescue, everybody across that kind of Cat 2, Cat 1 responder space. So everybody involved in the emergency services. So you always get to see lots of different people through these webinars. It's a chat, there's no presentations, no slides, it's very much a conversation. And that conversation between myself and the speakers will be structured. We've had a bit of a chat about it. But we're also looking to engage with you as well. So we have a Q&A function on the side of your screen. So if you have any questions as we go along, pop them in there, and that will help us to perhaps move our chat around from the structure that we have, but we think it's important to engage with you as well. Should last about 45 minutes. This is our first one, so it's all a bit new to us, but I'm sure it'll go really well, which leads me to be able to introduce our speakers today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Helen and Rob. So I think they're going to appear on our screen shortly. There they are. And Rob. Lovely. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at our first webinar. Helen is Business Resilience and Emergency Planning Lead for Northumberland County Council, and Rob is the Rural Crime Team Supervisor from Cheshire Constabulary. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. You'll see on your screen there is a little poll. I think Helen and Rob can see it as well, to find out who it is that's watching us today. So I want to just ask colleagues, if you've joined us and you haven't pressed the poll, so please do that. We can see it at the moment with lots of different choices. We're really curious to see who's with us today. So perhaps if colleagues who are in the background of this webinar could reveal the results, and we can have a little look and see who's with us today. So let's have a look. So it's quite a range. So fire, police, votes is sort of changing. Not everybody's doing it. It just gives us a little bit of a flavour about who's here. So that's good for us to know. Brilliant. Okay, so let's start then. Let's talk, guys, about the Emergency Services show. So you both spoke. You were the first speakers in our Resilience and Recovery Theatre on the first day back in September. Just give us an idea about what you spoke about, what your impressions were, what kind of audience reaction you had, and just give us a sort of reprise for people who weren't able to join us at the show. So Helen, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I talked about, I was kind of setting the scene for what was going on nationally within the resilience agenda. So covered everything from integrated review, security review, the National Risk Register, the National Resilience Framework, the Lead Government Department document, and then kind of brought it a bit more to life, or hopefully brought it a bit more to life, because I was also talking about some personal experiences of Storm Arwen from 2021. It doesn't feel like that long ago, 2 years ago, and just how all of those risks and things come together, and how we then have to work in partnership to deliver on them and make sure that we can respond in a coherent way.
Right. And what sort of questions did you get from our audience? What were they most interested in?
So there was a wide variety, actually. The audience was really interesting. It was a real good cross-section of representatives there from some colleagues who I hadn't seen for years, and it was great to catch up with them face to face, because this actually was the first big face-to-face event I'd been to since COVID. So that was it was really enjoyable to have that opportunity to interact like that. But there were also colleagues from the civil service there as well, who were reflecting on some of the comments I'd made about the national policy frameworks that had been published. So questions around about that, and some of them were conversations, kind of conversation points about what I thought the Chief Resilience Officer role should be, for example, was one of the questions that I got. But then also down to how are we engaging with our communities, and how are we making sure our communities are resilient to respond to big incidents in their area, and everything in between, really. So because I was covering, such a wide church of information, such a broad spectrum of national policy, personal experiences, community input, the questions were wide ranging as well. But the audience was so engaging and so happy to ask me questions, and it didn't feel like I was being tested, but it was really nice to talk to other colleagues and talk about that and reflect on some of their learning as well. Some people in the audience were kind enough to share their experiences and their learning as well.
Yes, excellent. So I just let our viewers know that I found you via the Emergency Planning Society. So you were, I think, a former chair. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I was. Yes. I was a chair. Quite a long time ago, but I was. We had an interesting time as chair of the Emergency Planning Society, and have still got contacts within that organisation.
Yes, and who were very representative of the show as well. So it was good to have them there. So Rob, you wrote for Emergency Services Times about Winter Storm, told us all about it, and I thought it would be great for you to talk at the show about it. So how did that go down? How was your experience of sharing your very wintry indoor exercise at the show?
Yeah, I think we actually held it on probably, I think it was the hottest day of that year, which was quite a shock for everyone involved going into the indoor ski slope. There we go. The thought process behind it was we'd always had this massive concern about what would actually happen if we had people stranded in a vehicle up in a remote location. We're not getting the roads gritted as much as we'd probably like these days. Real sort of testing, stress testing kind of our abilities. And we've done this tabletop exercise. Thought to myself, well, no, that's not good enough. We really need to make ourselves and our colleagues suffer for a little bit in a controlled environment. So we decided we'd hire this indoor venue, the biggest ski slope in the UK, and roll the car at the bottom of it, put casualties in it, and then make emergency services walk all the way to the top of back down to it again, just to really test our equipment, test our sort of Jessup principles, everything. We just wanted to really stress test it. And we've done it deliberately in a horrible way, so everything could go wrong and did go wrong, because it's all very well planning and training for the best principles. We do that all the time. Let's remove some of them. And that's what I came to talk about at the show. And it was a fantastic opportunity for me to kind of explain what we'd done, principles behind it, why it was important that we should train for the worst kind of scenarios as well, things that we not necessarily thought about, using our imagination as well to try and get it done. And we had a brilliant chance to speak to colleagues from all the different emergency services, our fantastic voluntary services as well, industry. And I think that's where we got this key crossover, which we've been kind of scared to do before. The emergency services are always very conscious about that, but we've got to realise that we can't do this alone. We don't necessarily have always the right kit. So, someone might have that answer out for us that's going to help us kind of save lives, not only other people's, but look after ourselves while we're out and about. Good opportunity to kind of sell that idea. And the questions we got from everyone was brilliant, including from British Transport Police, who might be on here, asking whether or not they could wedge a train carriage at the bottom of the ski slope, which I'm sure we're open to all kinds of ideas. So watch this space, see if that happens.
I like the idea of trying to get a train carriage into a ski slope. Okay. So interesting that you both sort of came out. So Helen, you came out of a sort of strategic perspective. I asked you to talk about a national resilience framework, the national risk register, and I'm interested to sort of perhaps just pick up on those a little bit now in terms of if you have national policy, you guys are working at the front line, as it were, in terms of resilience. And so when you have these big policy documents coming through and something like in a national risk register, we see that climate change as a heading isn't in there. but the impacts of climate change are in there. And I just wonder, in terms of your work within your organisations, how do you sort of take those the risks and then deal with them at your local level? How does that work? What is the practical ways in which you take these, I think it's 89 risks, and how do you then make them real at a local level? So I wonder if we can kind of explore a little bit. Perhaps Rob, if you could talk about that for us a little bit.
So kind of reverse engineered that kind of question for us, it was very much learnt experience and actual kind of exposed to one where we're going out there in the snow. So we're seeing the kind of the knock-on effects, the end results of climate change and those issues. So we've then kind of gone backwards against that. It's probably not the best way of doing it. We looked at it and said, well, actually, how are we challenging this? Where does it fit in? Since the show, since doing the actual operate or the exercise, the conversations we've had with people that work on a much more sort of national, regional level as well, it's fascinating because we're now trying to link in with that. We're seeing a lot of these sort of priorities that are talked about, all these potential impacts for storms. I've got the wonderful second hat of originally being the snow sergeant for Cheshire, and now it's the extreme weather sergeant. So we're now looking at how we develop that and say, okay, now I know, brilliant title, but there we are.
Should that be a role in all the organisations now, the chief weather sergeant?
Not for me to say, but it is an excellent thing to have on your LinkedIn profile. But it's that kind of thing where I'm learning very fast about speaking to people in flooding environments. We're swiftwater rescue techs anyway. But, we're looking at that. We're looking at sort of the storms, which we're talking about as well, trying to encompass and understand how all these bits lay into the national policy. And certainly we are seeing that they do link into that, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Helen, what about you? What does national resilience policy look like for you locally in Northumberland?
Okay, so that's a big question, Catherine, and I could talk about it for the whole of the 45 minutes, possibly non-stop.
Maybe pick out some headlines.
Yeah. So from a national risk register point of view, I sit on the local resilience forum's risk assessment working group, so we're responsible for assessing those risks at a local level and creating a local version of a risk register. I think one of the things that sometimes gets missed when we talk about the national risk register is we forget that actually there is a supporting document under there around national resilience planning assumptions as well. So you quite rightly said there are a lot of risks on the national risk register. The National Security Risk Assessment has over 90 risks on. You cannot write an individual plan for every single risk on the National Risk Register. And actually, nor should you, because you will be duplicating your work. So the approach looking at the National Resilience Planning assumptions is to look at what are the common consequences from those risks and actually plan for the consequences. So when you talk about climate change, the consequences of climate change is, to a certain extent, is weather. So there are a lot of severe weather related risks, and also there are other risks on the National Risk Register that could be impacted by climate change, public health type risks as well. And I think sometimes we can focus very much on this is the risk we have to plan for, but actually that risk leads to consequences, and how are we planning for those consequences? So one of the consequences is actually looking after your community. And how do you do that? Exercise Mighty Oak was an interesting one because the consequence of losing power is actually it hits your comms. So loss of telecommunications is a risk. It's also a consequence. So I think it's not as straightforward as just saying let's plan for all the risks on the risk register. It's actually let's understand what the risks are and understand the consequences and plan accordingly. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the narrative around risks and risk assessments. How we do that at a local level, well, actually, you tend to think about what is it that will make it real for people. And in Northumberland, we are a county of severe weather. So we do talk a lot about the risks that we face as a county, the storms, flooding. Getting people to take heat waves seriously in the northeast is slightly more challenging. Although what happened with the red weather warning, was it last summer before, made that slightly more real to individuals.
Yes, interesting. Interesting you talked about Mighty Oak just then. That was the subject of your talk at the show. Did you find that other people could relate to the exercise in terms of thinking about a national power outage? Had they done work themselves locally, or is it simply a national exercise that people were learning about for the first time? How relatable was it?
I think Rob might have some views on this as well, because actually I think of 38 LRFs in England, the majority of them actually took part. So I think some of our colleagues who worked at the national level have got some interesting statistics about how many people actually played. So if people weren't playing in it, they were probably aware it was going on. Right. So it was, and it is. I also came at it from a slightly different angle, because we'd experienced Storm Arwen and we'd lost power to large parts of the county for nearly 2 weeks. Yeah. So it was a very real risk for us, and we didn't have any problem getting any engagement at an LRF level or a local authority level to get people involved in playing, because we'd seen it happen. You are talking on an order of magnitude beyond what happened in Storm Arwen, so it can be difficult to make it real to people. But we all know that the cascading consequences from a power outage are significant, and Mighty Oak confirmed that, and made it much more realistic to people.
Yeah, and Rob, so in Cheshire, would you have been part of Mighty Oak in terms of the national exercise, or an onlooker, or where are you positioned with that?
So, with regards to that, that's actually dealt with by another team. We have that resilience team, as we're in the headquarters. So, not my area kind of speciality.
Right.
I do believe, having spoken to them, there were exercises that involved their teams.
Okay, all right. So that's interesting, isn't it? So Mighty Oak's a national exercise where you're checking what happens if the power goes, which is a huge, quite scary thought. And I wonder, in terms of organisations, how do you get your senior leaders to play when it comes to exercising? Because that's a national thing, which presumably got a bit more kind of interest. But if you're planning locally to do exercises to help you understand your risks and put all the mitigation in place, if you're doing training exercising, I noticed, I read Lucy Easthope's book, When the Dust Settles, and she talked in there about, just couldn't get people to come to exercises. They would all say yes, and then they would just not appear. It would go down the priority list. So I wonder what your experiences of getting senior leaders to be involved, and whether you have any sort of tips for people watching this about how you do get engagement at that senior level.
Helen, do you want to go first, or
do you want me to tackle that one? Okay, so I think it can be difficult. We both work in the public sector. And our senior leaders are busy. And we've got to acknowledge that, and so we've got to realise that their time is valuable. So if we want them to be involved in something like an exercise, it has to be something that is meaningful to them and is something that they can see as something that actually might happen. So we did a few years ago in a different organisation that I work in now. We did a large scale terrorist attack type exercise, which ran overnight, and I didn't have any problem getting people involved in that, because it was interesting. I was working in a city at the time. It was something that was seen as a credible risk. And we also had a lot of lead-in time, so I could brief them, and we could make sure that they were well informed. I have had other experiences where something else has come up, because actually, and we will all have experienced this, where actually we're going to an exercise and then a real incident happens. So we do have to be a bit pragmatic from time to time as well. I think for me, there is something here about what is relevant to your area. What is it that is on the current agenda? Can you make the exercise relevant to that? Can the exercise hit more than one thing for those individuals? Is it a training event? Is it something that's testing a plan? So getting your aims and objectives right, and also where you are in the cycle of your organisation. So trying to put an exercise on at the change of the financial year, for example, is proven to be challenging based on previous experience. So there's just some practical things like that. Don't ask local authorities to send senior reps to an exercise at the point where they're having local elections. So be mindful of timing in the year.
Helen.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Rob, do you have any similar tips from your experience in getting that buy-in?
I think an important one is testing policies, because people will put their names to a policy and say, I've signed this off, I think it will work. Well, okay, let's test it. And that was kind of one of the things that we've done with the snow plan. Other bits in Cheshire, we said, well, actually, it's all very well, everyone, senior leaders, they're quite happy to sign it off. But I was like, okay, well, let's actually see whether what we're saying is actually true. And certainly the learning that's come out of that has been quite impactful. In terms of doing it, we're all people that if you take yourself, you're going to go Christmas shopping now, you'll want to go into the shops that give you that experiential kind of that experience, as it were, as you go in to buy stuff. So you want the operations, the exercises, to capture people's imagination. You don't want to be reading it's a straightforward, we're going to do A, B, C, D, or whatever. You've got to make it so people have got that buy-in. They want to be a part of it. They want to learn something from it. We found that with the cold. People wanted to get cold. Very unusual, but there we go. But they also wanted to test their kit, their equipment, their resolve. It was a personal challenge for them. I think that's really important as well, because we often put on exercises where people will go to it and it's kind of rush and wait, and they'll get there and they'll hang around and but if you're actually really making sure someone's engaged, everyone who's involved, whether they're watching, all that, there's kind of an experience to it. It really helps. Cost is a nightmare. Trying to sort out that. We're in the public sector, so sometimes we have to say, well, we just can't afford to do this, and we have to come up with imaginative ways to try and get it across the threshold, as it were. But I think if it's anything, it's about creating exercises or training, like I said, that captures people's imaginations, right reasons, and stress tests. What we've already got in place.
Yeah, I wonder, Rob, at a point where you said about getting it signed off. Does that mean that a senior leader in your organisation is doing the sign off and kind of owns it? Do they become like your cheerleader, the person at the front who's actually going to bring leadership team with them? Does it work like that?
Well, I'm not going to admit to booking the slope before I even had permission, but I did do that. But the point is, we then went and invited all the senior commanders to the training session as well, because I wanted them to see it, wanted to showcase it, by involving all the different other organisations as well, inviting them along. We're very lucky that we have a viewing platform at the centre, so they could have a nice hot drink while the staff are downstairs, absolutely freezing, doing their bits. But it was that kind of, they could see it all happening and unfolding, and it gave that perspective. For instance, like our force incident managers, you may well be sat in a control room that's climate controlled. It might be sunny and Winsford for us in Cheshire, but we're knee deep, waist deep in snow in the Peak District. And it gave that kind of indication of what it's like to be only for 3 hours, let's say at -3, -5, when we can be out rescuing people for up to 8 hours. That kind of allowing people to kind of understand what it's actually like. And I think that's that whole buy-in.
Yeah. Okay. All right. But just looking at our Q&A, somebody's asked a question about the exercises and asking about community involvement and what scope is there to involve them. It says if individual resilience is considered when exercises are formed. So I wonder, do you have experience involved? So I think of exercises in terms of the local resilience forum, the members of the people who are making sure they're ready because they have responsibilities under the Civil Contingencies Act. That's what I think of, but I don't know how the community fits in with that. So Helen, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think there are probably pockets of good practice, but they're pockets, and I think we need to think about how we do it more. I have been involved with conversations with some parish councils who've wanted to be involved, but for one reason or another, it's never come off. I think, and this is not just about getting people there to act as volunteers to play parts either. This is about the community being properly involved, and actually being there, kind of taking part and demonstrating, and also there's that element of what do they bring, how do they fit into the command structure. These are all questions that we're still actually considering after Storm Arwen. I mean, I talked about that being 2 years ago, but we're still working through our community resilience project work on how do we get communities actually properly played into our command structure so that our operational commanders on the ground feel comfortable talking to our communities and our community leaders, so that actually their views are properly represented in. I think we understand the theory of that. I don't think I am not aware of examples of good practice that I could point people to and say, go and talk to them because they do it really well. We've done workshops with communities and we're educating communities, but I think getting them playing into exercises it's not something I've done yet. It is one of my ambitions. It's also something that the National Resilience Framework, I think, will hold us to account on, because it does talk about the whole of societal resilience.
Yes,
and we need to be talking to our communities in a more meaningful way around what they can do for themselves, how they can communicate with us. And Rob's point about, I could be sitting in a lovely control room in the southeast of Northumberland, and there's 14 foot of snow on the A1 at Berwick, and I would not know, unless I'm getting that information through my partners. But actually, I've got communities that can look out the window, and if we've got the right comms in place, they can tell me, and they can send me photographs.
Yes.
So
it makes me think about what is it, the Red Cross and Emergency Partnership? I'm trying to think. Yes, it's an acronym I'm thinking of, where to get those local groups, because community isn't a single thing. It's not a thing you can kind of look at and go, here's the community. The community is actually made up of lots and lots and lots of groups who interact with each other in all sorts of different ways and are not necessarily easy to define or contact. So I imagine every area would have different ways of dealing with what they would call community. Rob, you want to thoughts on that?
And also, it depends what you talk about community as well. For instance, the 4x4 community, they saw there was a need for helping transporting nurses to places and doctors to places and getting meals across. And they themselves created like the 4x4 response groups as well, didn't they? That you see across various different counties, and how
Can I just stop you there, Rob? Are you talking, because there's a question on this, because Tam from Northwest 4x4 Response has mentioned that in the Q&A. Was that just a complete coincidence? Well, there you go. How good is that?
Chance that is. That I can't see that question. I've not looked at it. But my point being, when we talk about communities, you've got communities that are living there, that are trying to get on with their lives, as it were, and then you've got actual hub communities together, created civil aid groups. Civil aid. You've got all these people. They are part of our community doing great work, but wanting to actively be involved. And we have to kind of agree with Helen. We've got to learn from that to see how we celebrate that, involve them, and kind of move forward with it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Excellent. I was just looking at the Q&A. There's another question here about exercising, which talks about involving all sections. It says, historically, from experience, the breakdown between blue lights and Cat 2 responders have caused some pretty big issues. I don't know what the context of that is. Does that sound something you wish to comment on? Does that sound familiar to you?
Without more detail,
your experience? Yeah.
So, well, I can maybe have a go at answering it. We're quite fortunate in the Northeast that we've got some pretty good engagement on the LRF from our Category 2 responders. That's a really big blanket statement. We've got good links in with our utility Category 2 responders, I would say. So we've got ongoing working relationships with them, and they are invited to exercises, and we do include them. There are gaps in that, because we are dealing with private companies as well. Learning from Storm Arwen was around probably the communication sector, and they are Category 2 responders, but that market is highly disparate and probably hard to connect with, although we do have links and contacts with BT. So I would say it's probably, again, we do find, when I talk to colleagues around the country, I do find that relationships with Category 2 responders varies. But again, they're private industries, and I think sometimes we've just got to remember that. So while they are Category 2 responders and they are expected to work with Category 1 responders, sometimes we might need a bit of help in influencing them. But I've been really fortunate. I've worked with some very good, strong organisations who have got people who do emergency planning. So I've got links directly to my peers within those organisations.
Yes. Okay. All right. So let's move away from that kind of community discussion for the moment and think about. I was thinking about what you say about Storm Arwen. So it was 2 years ago, Helen, and we've just had Agnes, Babette, Kieran, And I just wonder, in that, because it's a very recent experience, whether what you learned from dealing with Storm Arwen 2021, were there any specific learnings that you used in the period we've just experienced that meant you were able to do things differently and better? And whether you can pinpoint anything in particular to show how learning feeds into the process of responding to enable this loop to keep going. So if you could share that, Helen.
Yeah, so I think from a Storm Arwen happened, I'd been in post for 6 weeks. So I I was already on a steep learning curve.
So it's your test.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time, but it also meant that I was quite objective, and I was able to go in and look at our plans, policies, and procedures, and look at how are we doing things, where can we improve. And one of the things about Storm Arwen, which people may remember, is that it was winds. The thing about Babette was actually it was rain, but it was winds for Storm Arwen, and they were coming from an unusual direction. They were coming from the northeasterly wind, which is not the general prevailing wind direction that we experience within the northeast, which is what caused a lot of the tree damage. And the reason I emphasise that is because when Storm Babette came along, Storm Babette was for us in the northeast was actually yellow weather warnings. Storm Arwen did get to red, which was an interesting experience in itself. Seeing a red wind warning over your patch is it's slightly scary, and you're not
especially 6 weeks into the job.
Yeah, you're also kind of like, what does that actually mean? So when the Storm Babette weather warning came along, it said, kind of hidden away in the text, was the wind direction is going to come from the east. So immediately, I kind of went, "Oh, that's not good. That's reminiscent of what happened with Storm Arwen." We had an existing severe weather protocol which had worked really well at the beginning of Storm Arwen, so I stood that up. But I stood that up very quickly. I probably stood that up quicker than I did with Storm Arwen. However, I was also more familiar with it because I'd also activated it several times in the preceding 2 years. What we'd also done is we had broken out our on-call arrangements. So we'd gone from having a big on-call arrangement to which was kind of one level, to separating it out and being much clearer on who was tactical and who was strategic. So that was Storm Babette was the first time where that was fully tested. Bits of it had been tested prior to Storm Babette, and we'd iterated some of our procedures. But actually, Storm Babette meant that we activated our severe weather protocol, we activated our brand new Northumberland incident response plan, we activated our new tactical level, we activated our new strategic level, and it all worked. And
I wonder what the punchline was going to be.
Yeah. We have, and our incident response plan has been iterated over the last couple of years with smaller incidents where we've activated it and we've tested little bits of it. So it was great, and we had some contacts within the communities who were able to proactively get in touch with and say, we're getting reports of problems in your area. Can you tell us what's happening? So that was also very helpful. That was more on a one-to-one basis, probably, than necessarily kind of individually, kind of personality driven is the phrase I'm looking for. There's always stuff to learn, isn't there? So there's stuff from Storm Babette we're doing the full debrief on that tomorrow. So there'll be learning that'll come out of that, which will enhance some of the lessons from Arwen, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay, and so for you, Rob, I mean, I'm thinking that your winter storm was lots of snow. Did you get lots of snow? Have you been able to do anything with it since then? Because I think that might be a bit harder.
Yeah, it's a tricky one in that sense. So we've been through all the debriefs about it. There's been a lot of learning about it. But what we have kind of ramped up, very similar to what Helen was saying there, only next week, as we get into the winter period now, we've got a meeting with Cheshire Search and Rescue, Buxton Mountain Rescue Team, all the sort of local authority, neighbouring police force, all coming together. It's that kind of getting it early. What have we got capabilities wise? Let's go through, make sure we've all got our vehicles on the road. Simple things like that. So you can have as many policies in your place. And we've got one interesting email every year. Can you let us know how many 4x4s you've got? And it's like, I absolutely can. But actually, it's about making sure they're all right. We're going to be out testing, checking the winches all work, checking all the recovery equipment. the bits and bobs. So it's that kind of self-discipline as well, when you recognise that you're responsible for that kind of field of work where you're going to be putting yourself and others in potentially silly situations, controlled as much as they can be, obviously. But you're making sure that you're playing your part, and I think that's what's really important. Everyone who's probably listening to this plays a part in it, and it's now, as we get into the scenarios where you think we're going to get extra, bad weather, we're going to get rain, we're going to get snow, we're going to get whatever, it's making sure we're all ready to go, so that when we need to do it. So again, it's that early setup and early conversations when we see weather warning.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about process so far, and policies and relationships and people. Let's talk about kit. So you both were at the Emergency Services Show. It is full of kit, some of which will be very relevant to the kind of scenarios that we've been talking about. And I wonder, through exercises, do they help you, A, test equipment, and B, do they kind of help you to identify gaps? And if they do, how do you fill those gaps, and how do you make sure that the market knows what your needs are? What does equipment look like in terms of your work? Rob, do you want to start with that?
Okay, so when we were having the debrief, it was quite amusing in a way, because there were obvious things that we picked up on the time that people came back with. I think the fire brigade were the first to get very cold, because all the kit they turned up in was designed to reflect heat away, to send the heat away, to keep them very cool.
Yes.
So we were noticing that after I'd made them traipse to the top of this hill and then traipse back down the hill, and if they'd forgotten any kit, go back up and go back again, they were literally shivering, hands were going cold. And if we're asking them or expecting them to use quite high pressure, high pressure in the sense of on their minds, as it were, equipment to do extractions from people from vehicles and stuff like that, they need to be able to do this. The ambulance crews didn't have head torches, for instance, and they're trying to carry bags of heavy equipment up and a hand torch. They're having to get other people to carry their equipment. So it was just silly little things that we're now putting kit together and trying to get this solved for if we have this kind of major incident. Things like the officers, when they were doing CPR on the dummy that was on the floor, absorbing the environment into their knees, because the trousers we wear are not designed to keep the snow out. So
gosh, they're so basic, aren't they? Such simple things, keeping your hands warm, making your knees comfortable if you have to kneel down.
Yeah, but the difficulty we have is it's cost. If we were in the Nordics, for instance, we'd have kit that would be allowed to do that because they'd be wearing it more time. We're issued with a kit that helps us with the climate that we're normally in.
Yes.
So it's like, who funds this? Do officers buy it themselves, which a lot of them do, and you end up in this kind of bizarre situation. So we're doing a lot of kind of learning from that across the three services, and even the excellent voluntary rescue services, to try and understand, did our kit work all right in that scenario, and so on. It was a fascinating thing from that point of view. One thing I will raise, though, that came up, and I speaking at the Emergency Services Show to a lot of the providers that were there, was you're putting LCD displays, touch screens on all your equipment, like medical equipment, stuff like that. And you've got your big bulky gloves on, and you've been freezing for 3 hours. It's moisture all over the screen. Just think about how that is. And there was quite a few equipment providers who got a little bit nervous about, we've tested the battery down to a certain temperature. Have you actually tested how your machine or your machinery works, your digital displays work in that kind of frosty, cold environment? A few nervous kind of smiles as they're going away to look at it.
Yeah. And did you have conversations with suppliers at the show about that? Did people come up and talk to you afterwards and kind of say, actually, I've got a solution for you?
Yeah, so had those conversations, but also went and I quite enjoy going around talking to other suppliers and saying, well, what would you do in this scenario? I've had some fantastic meetings following with lots of different private companies.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Services show that were represented there, or heard the talk and so on, and it's been brilliant because they have got solutions there that would be able to help us last longer in the field, looking after the people we need to do.
Yeah.
So
that helps you in Cheshire. That helps you in Cheshire. But what about more broadly? How do you make sure that kind of learning and the things that you're getting as a result of being with us get shared more widely? How do we do that? How do we facilitate that?
Well, from us, Winter Storm, hopefully it's coming back next year, already got lots of interest from other forces that have been in touch about it. So this idea is trying to create this platform. We're looking at kind of that national conversation now, so there's no point everyone else trying to learn. A lot of it, in fairness, everyone kind of knows. We're talking about our equipment. We all know when we're going to get cold. Now we've got to have that conversation, actually put the science behind it, and the justifications that actually evidence how it can actually save person time or whatever in the field looking after people. So it's now qualifying.
And of course you need the money and you need the funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're open up to all kinds of.
Yes. Okay. All right, Helen. Any thoughts on the equipment? How does that fit with your role in Northumberland?
Yeah, it's not because of the role I carry out and being in where I sit within the local authority. A kit in the same way that Rob's talking about is not something I get as involved in. A lot of what I'm looking at is kind of information management type stuff. But although having the opportunity to go and talk to some interesting telecom providers at the emergency services show was really helpful. So there was somebody there who is a provider of Starlink. Spent quite a long time talking to them, and some other information management type systems as well, which was interesting. But like Rob said, money is always the problem. It's always the barrier in the public sector, is who's going to pay for this, and what we're going to use it for, and will we use it properly. I also need to be slightly careful that we don't just go and proliferate a lot of IT kit, because that's really easy to do and not always helpful.
Yes. Okay. I understand that. All right. So I'm just going to have a quick whiz through our questions and see, because we are coming up to sort of the endish of where we should be talking today. So I've got some hints asking about managing live incidents. How does the bronze, silver, gold command team communicate effectively with the long tail of support agencies? I'm not sure what a long tail of support agencies is, but do either of you want to respond to that?
Well, on the ground sort of thing, obviously GESIP, if people are following this that haven't or aren't aware of the GESIP principles, I don't know where you've been, but essentially have a review of that, look at that. You should see how it should work as a gold standard with commanders on the ground represented from every kind of agency, and that can go to Cat 2, depending on the scenario and how big it is, how long we're in play for.
Yeah.
And part of that part of the exercise was removing some of those commanders as well and seeing who fixed those gaps or filled in. And where communication would break down. But from sort of on the ground, plan is they should be co-locating, they should be speaking to each other, decisions, everything should be planned. And I imagine Helen will say that that's reflected in sort of the command level as well, higher up.
Yeah. So the GESIP principles apply all the way through the command structure. And certainly for some of the incidents where we've got TCGs stood up, for example, tactical coordinating groups, we can do those remotely, which means that actually the long tail of support agencies can be involved. And we have some TCG meetings where the meeting attendance is enormous. That can present a different set of challenges, but it does mean that information is being shared between people who need to know. And we also can convene physical tactical coordinating rooms, so coordinator centres, and the same at the strategic level as well. So that's generally how that works. Pretty standard process.
All right. One question, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to ask you all the questions because there's quite a few here, but I've just picked this one out here, which asks about that it's easy to write the lessons down, but it's much harder to learn from them. What reflections do you have on barriers to learning and how to remove them? I think that's a really interesting question. So we assume that there's this wonderful feedback loop going on where you're exercising, you're learning, you're putting it into your processes, you're testing, you're doing all the way around. But this is suggesting that there may be some barriers to learning. So do you have any thoughts on that, Helen?
So thanks, Matt, for that question.
Oh, do you know Matt?
Yeah, I do. It's a very good question, and it's an ongoing perennial issue. There have been papers being written by colleagues from the Emergency Planning College about kind of common lessons that have been learned from various exercises. So it is a known problem. And from a personal point of view, one of the things that I've been working within our LRF is actually an assurance board and an assurance tracker. That means that we can properly track what lessons are being identified and then how they are being applied. So I was just at the strategic board this morning where the final iteration of the foundations for that has been agreed. So we're going to start populating it from our own debriefs from our own local incidents, but also lessons from inquiries. We're going to test it with at least one of the national standards to check how that goes. We'll be mapping it against the national risks, the common consequences, the standards. We're using a set of capabilities that we can also track again, so we can start to identify trends. And then we're also going to be prioritising them but also using some of the risk methodology around whether or not you tolerate it or you treat it or you transfer it. Because there are some of these lessons which we identify, but the barriers might be outside of our control. We might not be able to remove them. It could be cost, it could be policy, it could be legislation, it could be lack of influence. So until we start to actually recognise the patterns around some of that, it's very difficult to have the conversation and provide the evidence and try and shift stuff. So I don't think that's a complete answer for Matt, but I can talk to him about it offline. But I do think it's a massive challenge, and again, it's really frustrating for people who've been around a long time, who go into exercises and go, well, I can write the debrief before we've had the exercise. It's quite cynical. But we need to start thinking a bit differently. We need to start thinking about systems rather than just our little bit of the world.
Yes. Okay, that's interesting. It sounds quite complex. All the things you sort of rattled off there, that list. I imagine this enormous Power BI dashboard sitting in a huge control center in your office, and it all being very technical. But is that the reality? Is it all very, is the technology able to help you manage all of that?
Yeah.
Are you setting things up?
Yeah.
What sort of technology are you using?
I think that's a good question. And I think some of the one of the pilot areas for Stronger LRF. And what I would like to see from that, because it's going to be a 2-year project, is some legacy where actually we're going to address some of this stuff and put in place some level of automation potentially to help us track some of this stuff. Because at the moment it's on an enormous fancy spreadsheet that somebody's built.
Right.
Based on ideas that have been given, and it's going to be put on Resilience Direct. But I know there are systems out there that could help us track this and do it more efficiently than needing that individual intervention from a person all the way through it. So I would love to see some legacy development from Stronger LRF pilots, where actually we can look at some of this stuff and maybe answer some of these difficult questions and help our community put a bit of automation in place and use IT to help us a bit more.
Yeah. Okay. And whilst Rob, I'm not going to be able to cover barriers with you because we're going to run out of time, but I just wanted to just pick up on that issue of Stronger LRF. Does that mean that the Chief Resilience Officer is in those Stronger LRF areas? Is that part of the same thing, or are they separate things? Because that's one of the changes that we're going to see in resilience forums, is having a Chief Resilience Officer. So we didn't cover it earlier, but we just quickly do that.
Yeah, Chief Resilience Officers will be appointed in the 8 pilot areas. Those pilot areas are due. The pilots, they've been nominated. They're going through the process of writing their business cases to release funding from Treasury. They're due to start in January, but the funding probably won't be released until the new financial year. And as part of that, they will be appointing a Chief Resilience Officer. So the Chief Resilience Officers have not been appointed yet, but will be within the first 6 months of next year. Let's be generous with that as a timeline. We'll see how long it takes.
Yeah. Okay. And so, Rob, is that going to affect you in Cheshire as a Stronger LRF? Is Cheshire an area?
I don't think we are one of the test areas, no. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. We are in.
Yes.
I don't know. Speaking to people in other areas that are part of that pilot project as well. So it'll be fascinating to see how that goes, because it helps add weight behind me wanting to continue to push, an improvement.
Yes, and it all comes back to that point we made earlier, which was around how do you elevate resilience within the organisation to get the leadership buy-in for exercises, but also at strategic level in terms of budgets, in terms of being part of these pilots. And I interviewed John Barradell, who headed up was it the City of London? Yes, I think that's right. And he talked very much about how do you make sure the line of sight is there between resilience and the leadership to ensure that that they're in the right place in the organisation. So I think maybe the Chief Resilience Officer is something to watch with great interest to see how successful that is. Maybe something we can revisit in a future podcast. So I think that might bring us to the end of our time. It is now 10 to 3. We've got slightly over, so I apologise if you needed to leave. I'd just like to just summarise really. I think for me, the big thing I got from this seminar was around, resilience is a really big, interesting topic. You are working in a fascinating space, doing very practical exercises in, snowy indoors, and talking about, you know, massive power outages. I mean, just the extent of it is amazing. That there is all this equipment that you need to do your jobs, it's technology, it's lights, it's things for your knees. You know, it's a really eclectic, interesting space. I'm so pleased to have you both here today to talk about it. I wonder if you could just invite any further thoughts. Is there anything you'd like to just finish off with, or whether you're happy just to close it there?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're working in our kind of field, it's almost having that brutal, for me anyway, dogged determination to keep pushing the messages and keep being that champion for it, and exploring ways of keeping it fresh. That's the thing. It's about getting that buy-in, because you don't become stale. You don't sort of say, this is just what we're doing. Always improving, always moving forward, and get people involved.
It's a great tagline, resilience, keeping it fresh. How about you, Helen?
I think we're in a really exciting time. We've got a massive opportunity with the National Resilience Framework, and I feel very fortunate to be in one of the pilot areas to actually test some of this stuff. And it's just really nice to have forums like this to be able to talk to similar-minded people and share learning and talk about the future of the profession.
Excellent, good. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to join us today to take the conversation from the show, and you know, here we are a few months on, just kind of thinking it through, talking about it. Just fantastic. So it leaves me just to wrap up for today. So thank you both for your time today. The webinar will be available to watch on catch up, so via our website and the link that presumably everybody signed up on today. Any notes in the webinar will be hosted there too. I'm going to do a bit of a write-up so you can get sort of 500 words and a quick summary to share with people. You can sign up for our next webinar. So we have one next Thursday and the Thursday after, drones and electric vehicles from the same platform. And if you go to our website, emergencyservicestimes.com, you can read about lots of emergency services things too. So it just leaves me really to thank you for watching, and hopefully see you here next week. Thank you.
Thank you.